High Point University presents A Conversation with Celia Sandys and Nido Qubein is a production of UNC-TV in association with High Point University.
Hello, I'm Nido Qubein, president of High Point University, and again we welcome you to this program. It has been our tradition on our campus to invite some thought leaders from across the world to share their ideas, to share their vision, to instruct our students, and to hopefully inspire you as you listen to yet one more conversation with a fascinating citizen of the world. Today I interview Celia Sandys, a speaker, an author, a television presenter, and the granddaughter of Winston Churchill. Ms. Sandys, welcome to High Point University.
Very nice to be here.
I'm delighted that you're here. You were 21 years of age when your grandfather passed away. You had a lot of years with him. What is it that you remember the most about him?
I remember so much about him because as I grew up and we spent a lot of time with our grandparents when we were children. And so my earliest memories are of my grandfather from when I was very, very young. And then, of course, as I grew up, he grew older. But then, you know, we had different experiences. And I was really lucky that I traveled with him in his later years.
Where did you travel to?
Well, the first time was one day we was at Chartwell, his country house in Kent, and he asked my mother if she and I would like to accompany him on the Onassis yacht that summer. It was, and so I held my breath till she said yes. I was nearly 16, and nowadays 16-year-olds, they travel the world long before they're 16. But then we couldn't really leave England very much because we weren't allowed to take any money out. And so I think I'd only been abroad once before that. So suddenly we were going to go on this incredible yacht to these amazing places. It was incredible.
Were you hosted by Mr. Onassis?
By Mr. Onassis and his wife and his two children. They're all these four members of the Onassis family who a few years later were all going to come to tragic ends. But also on that yacht was Maria Callas and her husband. So that was quite an interesting experience.
Did he offer you any ouzo to drink on the yacht?
Well, he didn't offer me any because I was probably a bit too young. But everyone else was offered it.
Good. So in North Carolina, we have a very distinguished state representative by the name of Craig Horn. He is known as an expert on the life of your grandfather. He's taught us all about its history, about his history, and he quotes him very often. I made some notes from his last presentation. He reminded us that, of course, your grandfather was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was a Nobel Prize laureate, received in 1953, I believe. And something I didn't know, he was an honorary citizen of the United States. I'm not too sure how many honorary citizens of the United States there are from other lands, maybe 2 or 3 others. Do you know?
Well, I think the first one was Lafayette, which must have been about a century or so before. But otherwise I'm not quite sure, but it was obviously a great honor. But of course my grandfather was half American. His mother was American. She was born in Brooklyn. And when he went and spoke in Congress during the war, he said if my father had been American and my mother British instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own. So in view of the events that have just been taking place, I think he would have very much liked to have been the President of the United States.
And he could have been.
Might have been.
Yes. I heard you speak to an audience. You gave a live presentation. You're a wonderful speaker. You recall history and lessons that you've learned from your grandfather in ways that everybody watching us today can relate to and recall and find value in. What would be 1 or 2 stories that your grandfather either told you or that you extracted from your conversations with him that have left an indelible memory on you or have taught you a lesson that you have found to be useful in your own life?
Well, I think that one thing he used to tell us when we were children, he said, never let the sun go down on your wrath. So you must make up when you have a quarrel. And I think that's a useful lesson to learn, because, you know, if you do, then it stops people being resentful and harbouring grudges. You just make it up and get on with life. And I think that was useful. The other thing he always said was that courage was the most important quality. And if you think about it, if you don't have courage, you can't really do anything, because courage is needed to have if you have integrity, you need the courage to go forward with what you believe in and not be told what to do by others if you don't believe in it. So I think those were the two sort of key lessons that he taught.
Powerful lessons. To not to go to sleep having a misunderstanding with someone, to sort of fix it before you do that. And of course, you know, if you take risk out of life, you take opportunity out of life. And it demands of each of us to have courage to pursue our dreams and make something. This is what we tell our students on the campus of High Point University. You must have a sense of tenacity and courage, and you must be willing to take a risk occasionally, and occasionally you fail. And in failure, there is also a great value.
But you've got a beautiful university here.
Thank you.
I was so impressed. I came here yesterday and looked around, and your buildings are wonderful. What a campus. And what a wonderful message you send out.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. The most important thing, of course, about any university, including High Point University, is not that we live in a wonderful and learn in a wonderful environment, but it's the people who believe the kind of beliefs that they have. And we are a God, family, and country school. We believe wholeheartedly in the principles that your grandfather spoke of, and building relationships, building bridges, getting along with people, making good things happen, and taking a risk once in a while to do something significant. See, can you take me to sort of a familial setting? Try to describe when you were a little girl, a setting where your grandfather was there. When you came in and he was sitting there, did you go run to him, hug him, kiss him? Did you sit on his lap? Did he read you a book? Did he describe something you were doing in school? I mean, of course, he was a very busy fellow, and he was doing all kinds of things, clearly. But did you sit with your family around a table with him to have breakfast, dinner, a cup of tea?
Never breakfast. My grandfather once said that he and my grandmother had breakfast together once. They tried it once, but never again. He was one for a solitary breakfast. And the favourite thing was to go in the morning. I used to love going in to see him in the morning. He'd be having his breakfast. He'd be in bed having his breakfast with his cat curled up beside him on the bed. The bed would be strewn with newspapers. He might have a secretary taking dictation, and his poodle, Rufus, would be running around, and his budgerigard, Toby, would swoop in to share the breakfast. And that was sort of the start of the day. And then, with a bit of encouragement, he'd get up and we would be able to go for a walk. And this would be in Kent, at Chartwell, his house in the country. And then we'd go to feed the goldfish. He'd made, when he bought this house, he'd made wonderful water features, because he'd grown up at Blenheim Palace, where there was wonderful water. And I think this had sort of influenced him. And so we would go first to the big golden orf that he'd put in a pond, and he would throw the food in, and they, unsurprisingly, would come up to the surface to eat it. And he'd always say, "You see, they know me." We then tried for ourselves and saw they knew us just as well.
Yes.
And then we'd go to visit the pigs. And my grandfather used to say, "Dogs look up to us, cats look down on us, but pigs treat us as equals. I do like pigs." But the man who was going to win the Nobel Prize for Literature couldn't think of anything more interesting to say to the pigs than "oink, oink."
Did you, what time of the day did you wake up in the morning?
Oh, he woke up, I think he went to bed very late, because what he used to do was his day would start, he'd probably wake up about 8 o'clock and have breakfast. But then he'd take quite a long time to get ready because he'd like to have his bath and all of that. And then he'd appear. But then we'd have meal times were very important. He used to like being at the table. My picture of my grandfather is really at the dining room table with as many members of his family around him as possible. This was important to him because he'd had rather a bleak childhood, and he spent his whole childhood trying to get the approval of his father and the attention of his mother. And so he wanted to have a nice family life himself. And so he'd be there. He would wear, during the war, he developed this, what he called his Siren Suit, which was, he knew he was going to have to jump out of bed a lot when the air raid sirens went off. So to put on a collar and tie, and like you're wearing now today, that would take time. So he developed this suit which zipped up and down, what we'd now call a onesie, which is considered rather a contemptible garment. But he loved this, and he used to have them in tweed for the day and in jewel-coloured velvet for the evening. And so this was what he wore. And every meal was an occasion. My grandmother made all the food was absolutely perfect. I can't say she cooked it herself, but she knew a lot about food. And my grandfather wasn't happy until everyone had a glass of champagne.
How far distance-wise did you live from his primary home?
Well, his favourite home was Chartwell, and that was only 19 miles from London, where we lived. But we used to stay there a great deal.
What did he complain about when he would sit around the dinner table having a glass of champagne? What bothered him? What did he verbalize as concerns about the world, about people, about matters of significance?
I think that he wasn't someone who really looked back, I don't think, terribly. He was someone who looked forward. And I think by the time he died, the greatest regret he had that he didn't see the Berlin Wall come down. That was his greatest worry, because he was always able to see ahead what was going to happen. So he could see what was happening before the war, and he knew that what Hitler was doing in Germany, and he knew much more than the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, knew, because he was finding out from all the ministries in London how ill-equipped we were for war. And then he also had numbers of people who came from across the Channel, who would tell him exactly what Hitler was doing in Germany. And that was how he became so well informed.
Did he ever scold you about something?
I don't think he did, but I think somehow we were quite well behaved. I don't know why. We weren't so well behaved elsewhere, but we were pretty well behaved when we were with him, I think.
Do you remember something he used to compliment you about?
He used to, well, what was interesting was when I was on the Onassis yacht with him, whenever we arrived in a port, I would, again, probably go and see him while he was having his breakfast. And he'd make me look out of the window and he'd say, "What do you see?" And that's what he wanted to, he saw everything with the eye of an artist, because his favourite thing in life was painting. He loved painting. By the time he died, he'd painted more than 500 paintings. And so this was something, it was really also his stress buster. I mean, he would sit for hours painting, and everywhere he went after 1915, because after the big tragedy of the Dardanelles in World War I, he took up painting. I think other people might have gone into therapy, but he took up painting, and his paints went with him, except during World War II, when he only painted one picture. That was when he hijacked President Roosevelt from the Casablanca conference and took him to Marrakesh to see the sun setting on the Atlas Mountains. And that painting has just been sold about a year ago to Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie for $2.5 million. I don't know what they're going to do with it. I hope they don't cut it in two.
Did any of the paintings remain in the family?
Yes, they did, a large number of them, and a large exhibition at Chartwell. And last year there were 2 or 3 exhibitions in in America of the paintings. They do come here sometimes.
I read somewhere that he gave you as a gift a toy bulldog. Am I right? Whatever became of that toy bulldog?
The toy bulldog was wonderful because one day my mother came in with this parcel. I was about 6, and there was a note attached to it which said, "Please look after him, your loving grandpapa." So I tore the paper off and found this toy bulldog who was big, life-size. He was about that big. And when I pulled him along, his head moved from side to side. But I was puzzled, 'cause why was I getting a present? So my mother said, well, someone sent him to Grandpapa and he thought you might like him. So I did, but why would anyone send a grown man a toy dog when he had a real dog of his own? So then she explained he'd been called the Great British Bulldog. So the next morning I went to school and I asked my friends, I said, my grandfather's a bulldog. What sort of dog is yours? No one admitted to their grandfather being a chihuahua or anything. But I think my mother was very good at giving away things. And I think the vicar's son got my bulldog. I'm rather sad about that.
In the mid-'60s, when Jack Kennedy was assassinated, you were with your grandfather. Take us there for a moment and describe the scene.
Well, on that day we were having dinner together at the London house, and the news came in, and someone put a television on the table. I'd never seen my grandfather watching television. It was a sort of something that was in a tiny little room that people could go to if they had to. And so we sat there and watched the television as the dreadful story unfolded, and history was made before our eyes. And tears poured down his face when the news came in that the president was dead. And then again, when Jackie Kennedy, still wearing her pink blood-stained suit, was witnessing the new president being sworn in on Air Force One. I mean, they seemed young to almost everyone, particularly for the position that they were in. But they must have seemed so young to that old man approaching his 90th year.
Do you recall any words that your grandfather uttered at that moment?
I don't think he uttered any. I think he was just so overwhelmed, and he was just, I mean, there was no question. He wasn't afraid of showing his emotions. And I mean, if he saw a sad or a very moving film, he would, but I'd never seen him quite as moved as that.
Did he cry?
Oh, of course he cried, yes, he absolutely cried, yes, no question.
It's interesting to note that such a person of great influence would also have the emotions of the weakest among us in many ways.
Oh no, on one occasion he always used to visit the bombed sites in London during the war. And on one occasion, one of the crowd, they said, oh, you see he's crying, he understands what we feel. He had no problem crying. He was very soppy.
At what point in your life, Celia, did you begin to understand or acknowledge, and those may have been two different time spots in your life, that your grandfather, Winston Churchill, was truly a great man of history?
Well, I think that this was the idea. The answer to that is gradually, because we children, I think after the war, the only people in the world who took Winston Churchill completely for granted were his grandchildren. Even his children were in awe of him. But for us, you know, we on the whole, apart from a few grand occasions, we only saw him at home, so we didn't see him going out when everyone was screaming and shouting good old Winnie and all of that. So, and we were protected from it. Our parents didn't bring us up telling us that he was so important or anything else. They wanted us just to feel he was our grandfather. But little by little, I observed how people spoke about him and how they behaved when they were with him. And that made me realize, you know, that people regarded him as very special. And that was how, little by little, that came home to me.
Did you attend his funeral?
Oh, of course, yes.
What stood out to you at that funeral, of something someone said, or some memory that you have, or some adjectives that...
Well, it was the most extraordinary day, and it was a day that I couldn't really appreciate properly until I went home in the evening and watched the television, because we all met that day it was a state funeral, which is something which a commoner really very rarely has. And so we all met at the Houses of Parliament, where his body had been lying in state for some days, which was another incredible thing. People were queuing all around the river over the bridges to file past the coffin. And so early in the morning we set off, and the men were walking behind the coffin, the women riding in the Queen's carriages. So my sister and I were in the second carriage, and it was as though you were taking part in a production, really. It was extraordinary. You didn't feel it was real. We were in the carriages. I was as close as I am to you were the crowds, and I could see tears pouring down people's faces, and there were so many crowds all the way to St. Paul's Cathedral. Then we got there, and then we were all watching as the coffin was carried up the steps, which was a tricky moment. They had rehearsed this, but they hadn't rehearsed a lead-lined coffin. So the pallbearers, as they went up the steps, they had honorary pallbearers who were the very old men who had served with my grandfather. And one of them was Attlee, who'd been his deputy prime minister. And he stumbled. As he stumbled, the pallbearers who were actually carrying the coffin, they had to stop. And fortunately, there was someone at the back who had to push on the coffin. Otherwise, a disaster could have taken place, because they hadn't accounted for the weight. It was terribly, terribly heavy. And so, of course, we all gasped at that, thought something terrible was going to happen. And then we had this incredible service with the whole of the royal family. And for the first time in British history, the monarch waved the president and waited for her humble servant to come in, and we were told, don't curtsy, you go straight to your places. And so this was a big event, and we had this wonderful service with the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which we sang today at your veterans breakfast, which was my grandfather's. He loved that, and that probably also in honor of his mother, who was American. And so the service was extraordinary. And then we went back to the side of the river where my grandfather was being taken on a barge, on a launch, to Waterloo Station to be buried. I think that was probably a joke of his, because we should have gone from Paddington Station to Oxford, but I think the Waterloo would have caused him a lot of amusement, because he'd have thought the French, we beat them at Waterloo, and I think he wanted to go out on that sort of an amusing note. But that's just me, but I suspect his fingerprints probably were over that particular decision. And then we took him to be buried at a very simple churchyard at Blaydon, within sight of Blenheim, where he'd been born 90 years before. And people, when they go to his grave, they're always struck by how simple it is. They expect it to be a grand thing, and it's just a country churchyard and a simple stone which says his name.
Your grandfather was known clearly for his leadership skills. He's quoted often in leadership books, often in lectures of all sorts, often among titans of industry and business. Tom Brokaw, who's a distinguished American journalist, was on our campus not too long ago and said of your grandfather that he was truly one of the great men of all time, a man who gave, and I quote Tom Brokaw, the voice of common hope to free people. In a recent issue of the Atlantic magazine, the question was asked, who's the most influential politician in history? And the author of the novel Masters and Commanders said, Winston Churchill. A war correspondent, a prime minister, they said, a Nobel laureate, an honorary American citizen, an amazing person. Where do you think he learned all that? Where did he amass such a vertical understanding of human behavior and behavioral economics and leadership qualities?
Well, when he became Prime Minister in 1940, he said, I felt as though I were walking with destiny, and all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial. Now, well, the thing is, he had such a wealth of different experience in his life. He was born in another world to us. He was born in a world of horses and carriages and gas lamps, and he ended with just before man walked on the moon. It's an incredible span. But I think that, first of all, he did many different things. He loved meeting people. He was always wanting, one day he went missing on a ship, and they said, where is he? Has he gone overboard? And then he was down in the engine room talking to the stokers who were stoking the boiler. He liked to find out about everything. He liked to get down to the nitty-gritty and find out what was going on. And of course, from the point of view when war was declared and he was the leader during the war, he had so much experience. I mean, he'd fought wars and he'd been a politician and a minister during wars, so he did know and he did understand what those men who were fighting were going through, and I think that's terribly important. I mean, I don't know about whether in America, but I mean now in our British Parliament, it's difficult to find anyone who's ever served overseas in it, and I think that is quite important. It's nice that you feel people do have the same experience that all those men and women are going through when they're fighting.
Yes, and he was, of course, a lifelong student, so he cared deeply enough to examine and dissect and therefore to learn and conclude why people do what they do and so on. In your book, We Shall Not Fail, it's a book on leadership, the inspiring leadership of Winston Churchill. I liked at the end of the chapters your Churchillian principles that you speak of. For example, and I'm quoting some from the book, make the creation and maintenance of good morale a daily aim. What does that mean to you?
Well, what that means to me is, if you bring it to an education level, we all know that students who enjoy what they're learning do a lot better. And the same way, if you have a good morale about your job, you're going to do it much better. And so I think that it's terribly important that they should do that.
So we say on our campus here at High Point University, we say who you spend time with is who you become. The zone in which you choose to reside influences and impacts the person you evolve into. The choices you make pretty much determine your future and your circumstances.
But I'm sure you, Nido, enjoy what you're doing here, and clearly you're doing an incredible job. So therefore, I mean, you're an embodiment of that.
Well, you're very kind, thank you. I think it's, I think that purpose leads to passion, and passion leads to energy. And energy leads to good work. You know, energy allows us to march forward with other people to bring good things to be. That is the essence of leadership. The essence of leadership is to inspire and grow other people, isn't it?
Well, certainly my grandfather felt from an early age that he had a destiny. He wrote to his mother when he was 23 and serving in India, and he said he wasn't afraid of bullets. He said, I believe I've been put on this earth to do something. And then he continued, and then a little while later, he said to a fellow officer, one day I'm going to be Prime Minister. And a few years later still, he was in South Africa, having been captured by the Boers and escaped. But he was sitting in a bar and talking to the station master of the yard where he'd pitched his tent. And he said, one day I'll be Prime Minister. None of them believed anything he'd said or the stories he'd told. And 40 years later, that station master opened his newspaper and said, by Jove, he's done it.
So we say to students here, there are no such thing as unrealistic dreams.
No, absolutely.
Only unrealistic timelines.
That's right.
You got to believe it if you're going to do it.
Well, he had to believe that we were going to win the war, because if he didn't believe that, he couldn't make everyone else in the country believe it during those terrible years while he was battling to keep Britain in the war until America could come and join us.
Absolutely. To inspire others, you must believe it yourself to begin with. Another one you said, I think this one's on chapter 10, page 188, you said, put bad news into perspective. Things usually get better, especially if a positive attitude prevails. You know, we humans don't want to believe that, but it is true, isn't it? That sometimes even out of adversity can emerge abundance.
Well, absolutely. I mean, certainly he believed that, and he believed you have to be optimistic. And if you go around saying, well, nothing's going to work, then it's not going to work. And you have get other people. If people believe it can work, then it can work. But if they don't, and if they're not led by someone who makes them feel that they can believe in themselves. I mean, it was said once that Hitler could make you believe that he could do anything, but that Churchill could make you believe that you could do anything.
Say that one more time.
That Hitler could make you believe that he could do anything, but Churchill could make you believe that you could do anything.
That's the heart of the matter, because it's in the cumulative effect of so many people that we can truly achieve anything sustainable. It occurs to me sitting here, do you ever get up in the morning or go for a walk or be pondering your life and thinking to yourself, if I could have him here again, I would ask him this question?
Oh, lots of times, yes, of course, especially, but I've been writing all these books about him, and if I could have had him there to ask him, you know. But this is the thing with all of us. I think so many people regret that they didn't ask their mother, their father, or their grandparents something until it's too late. And of course, I'd love to have asked him so many things.
What would be one thing you would ask him if he were sitting here today?
That's a big question.
Would it be a question about how he did something? Would it be a question about how he thinks about things? Would it be a question about how he achieved a certain level in his life?
I really think that I'd like him to know how he felt the day that he knew the war had been won, because I know how he felt the day he knew he'd been voted out of office, but how he'd felt that day, because it must have been an extraordinary feeling that there it was, and you know, it was over, it had happened, and you know, it had been done, because I mean, that was such a weight on his shoulders.
How did he feel when he was voted out of office?
Well, a lot of people around realized that, because the election, of course, was called in 1945, before the war was over in the Far East, but after the war in Europe was over. And I don't think he thought about it. I think he just felt this is going on, and he didn't even think about politics as such. Whereas, of course, other people, the opposition, were busying themselves around with politics, seeing an opportunity. But people around him, they could see the warning signs. And when I spoke to the two people who were with him, when it became clear to him that that the election had been lost. Of course, we don't vote for a person, we vote for a party. But three of them, two of his secretaries, a man and a woman who'd worked with him all through the war, and him, they sat there and had a good cry together in his office. That was how he felt. Then he obviously was shattered. And my grandmother said, well, this may prove to be a blessing in disguise. To which he replied, if so, it is very effectively disguised. But then the family immediately persuaded him to go on a painting holiday to Italy. And by the time he came back from that, he was feeling much better. But I think it would have been a tragedy. If he hadn't been out, I think it would have killed him. He was so tired.
As I said, I love those principles that you share in your book. One of them that caught my eyes on page 156, you said, balance resilience with compassion. The toughest leaders have a heart. Tell me about his heart.
Well, very early on, as a young man in South Africa, when the tide of the Anglo-Boer War was turning towards the British, he advised magnanimity towards the defeated, and the establishment absolutely said, no, we're not going to do that. And it wasn't till the Second World War where this was able to be brought into operation, and so balance his compassion. He had compassion. I mean, he loved all living creatures, whether they were human beings or animals. He loved animals. He couldn't resist having lots of animals around him.
Including the pigs.
Including the pigs, including the dogs, and he had a butterfly house. And so he was a very soft-hearted person, and he had a big heart. And I think that this was very important to him.
Is it fair to say that his grades were just okay? His grades? He was relatively sickly growing up as a child or teenager. Correct me if I'm misstating the facts.
No, I don't need to correct you. He was, as a student, he was sent as a boarder, age 7, to a very tough school, which was run by a sadistic headmaster who used to beat the children until they bled. And so finally his nanny found these marks on his back, and so she insisted to his mother that he should be removed, and he was, and sent to another school where they were very nice people. And so by the time he got to Harrow, which was the equivalent of your high school, he had had rather a sheltered life from the point of view once he'd got to the second school, and learned not a very broad education. But so he got there and was put in the bottom class, and the bottom division of the bottom class, and probably only got in because his father was a prominent politician. And he did well at the subjects that he saw the point of, and totally ignored the ones he didn't. So he didn't do Latin. Latin was terribly important then, and he couldn't go anywhere without Latin, and he refused to do that. But the headmaster and the English master really saw the point in him. And you can see in the archives of the school that the English master saved various pieces of work that my grandfather did. And, you know, this gave him huge encouragement. But his father decided that he was too stupid to be a lawyer, so he'd better go into the army. And that's what he did. And so then he went into the army and didn't go to university. He would have liked to have gone to university. When he'd finished in the army, he said maybe he'd go to university, but he wanted to go to Oxford, and he had to have Latin. And he said, well, I really can't waste all those years, so I'm going to go on without. He made his own university. When he was in the army in India, his mother sent out books and books and books, and I think when everyone else was having a siesta, he was reading his books.
In fact, later in life, he wrote to his mother, your great-grandmother, he wrote, and I quote, "I'm more ambitious for a reputation for personal courage. I shall come back afterwards the wiser and the stronger for my gamble." He was always learning and dissecting and figuring things out.
Well, he was very worried, I think, that he wasn't going to be able to be courageous, and he was, I think, proving that to himself. When he was in India, everyone else had a sort of camouflage-coloured pony to ride around, and he had a white one. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted to get medals. He wanted people to notice him, to get a reputation, because he was going to go into politics.
And he became an outstanding speaker, a much in-demand speaker, in spite of the fact that he had a speech impediment, in the sense that he could never say his S's well. And he practiced such phrases, as I think you state in one of your books, with statements like, and I quote, "The Spanish ships I cannot see, for they are not in sight." And he went to a throat specialist even to get cured. He didn't, still he excelled. And I found in your book a statement that he made that recommends and suggests that he wanted to speak, he wanted to communicate, he wanted to connect. And I'm quoting him now saying, "Asking me not to make a speech is like asking a centipede to get along and not put a foot on the ground." He loved to speak. He loved to share.
He did, but he gave it a lot of preparation. He used to rehearse his speeches in front of the mirror, and he even used to rehearse the jokes. His secretary told me that one day she was on the train with him in Washington when he was going to make a speech at Harvard, and he was going to say, and she heard him saying, the infernal combustion engine, and then correcting it to the internal one, and he rehearsed that many times. So, and one of his friends said, Winston has spent his whole life researching and preparing his impromptu speeches. So he didn't leave anything to chance. He wrote his own speeches. Of course, he had a lot of researchers helping him, but he always wrote them himself, so he knew what they were.
That's an interesting thing for college students and others to know and understand, that when something looks close to perfect, when something is extraordinary, it is incomplete and incorrect to assume or presume that one just has this natural skill born with it from childhood. But rather, you state he worked so hard to make his prepared speeches appear impromptu.
Absolutely, but he was also very nervous because one day when he was in the House of Commons, everyone's total night completely dried up. He didn't have notes, he was speaking, and he couldn't go on any further, and everyone looked around and they were so embarrassed for him. He never went out again without notes, just in case.
Just in case you go blank.
Yeah.
Very interesting. He ran Great Britain like a CEO running a business. Would you agree with that statement? He could have run a corporation, for that matter, easily. And throughout your book, you reference the parallels between running a business and running a country. Why is that still relevant today, or do you think that's relevant today?
Well, I think it all comes down to one word: leadership. And if you can inspire people by your leadership, and if you can choose the right people to have around you, that's terribly important, because one person usually can't do everything. You need to be able to choose the right people and to communicate. If you can't communicate, you really can't do anything in any leadership role. And I think this was one of his key things, that his communication skills were great.
I teach classes for freshmen and seniors here. All the freshmen take my class on life skills. Yesterday's class, I began with a bit of research which suggested that employers in profit and nonprofit sectors look at communication as the #1 ingredient they seek in a new employee. That absent your ability to build bridges of understanding with others, you therefore deny yourself the possibility of truly succeeding in a sustainable way. In fact, on page 229, you write, Churchill lived his life with the certainty that he would be a model to future generations. That may be a lofty standard, but it can't hurt an aspiring leader to try. Indeed, Churchill lived every day as if it might be his last. He rarely allowed mundane toils to spoil his pleasures. Perhaps that's the champagne bit and the talking to the butterflies and the pigs and so on. Churchill may have often worked until the wee hours, but he also catnapped when he could, and nearly always squeezed 8 hours of sleep into 24 hours, an achievement many modern-day executives might envy. All of this is accurate.
Oh, it is accurate, but what he always did every afternoon, he would have a siesta. But every afternoon, he didn't just go and lie on the sofa. He would go to his bedroom, change into his night clothes, get into bed, and have a proper sleep for at least an hour or so.
Wow.
And then he would get up, have his second bath of the day, and be ready for the evening. But then after dinner, we'd have dinner, we'd meet for a glass of champagne before dinner. We'd have dinner, and then, which took quite some time, and then we might have a film. He loved films, and then we'd go back to the sitting room, and tomorrow's newspapers would all have arrived. We'd probably go to bed, read the newspapers. His secretary would come and take dictation, and he would dictate late into the night, And then he would say, okay, as long as that's typed by 9 o'clock in the morning, that'll be fine. And he'd go to bed at 2 o'clock. Then, of course, the secretary would have to type it up.
Stayed up all night.
But anyway, he had a great team, and his secretaries, the ones that stayed the course, adored him. But if they couldn't stay the course, of course, they fell by the wayside because he was a demanding employer.
But he also was a man of a heart filled with a desire to serve.
Absolutely.
He wanted to serve, and he served in amazing ways.
But he was born in the days of the empire,
Yes.
when everyone, serving your country was paramount then, from the point of view that that
Yes.
was what we had to do.
On page 227 of your book, you speak of that. May I ask you to read this for us?
Of course.
And I marked it for you. I just want to hear it in your own voice.
One of Churchill's greatest gifts to future generations of leaders was the example of his abundant love of life. Through every challenge, imaginable and all sorts of weather, he lived life to the hilt. Modern-day leaders could do worse than to study how Churchill relaxed and enjoyed himself. His extraordinary accomplishments were aided in no small degree by the fact that he seldom became worn down by work. Though Churchill worked with an almost religious fervour, he had an intuitive sense of when he needed a break or holiday. Painting, entertainment, rich friendships, and other pastimes broadened Churchill's horizons and gave him the pauses he needed during his furious daily schedule as a world leader and politician. The monotony of a 9-to-5 grind would have dulled him. Indeed, it could be argued that only by his system of making his own hours and dispersing work with diversions was Churchill able to achieve such breathtaking productivity. That's a wonderful, uplifting message for a modern-day leader. Enthusiasm and inspiration come partly by finding your own rhythm.
Indeed. And it's not as easy as it sounds.
Not at all.
It is a demanding quality that comes with a tested period of time, with willingness and desire and commitment.
Well, and also he had a lot of people around him who could help him achieve it, which is important to remember.
But he also attracted those people around
Sure.
him and ensured that he was inspiring them. On our own promenade here, named the Castor International Promenade, we have a quote, a famous quote. There are many famous quotes, obviously, Winston Churchill. This one says, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." He believed that service is paramount in his life. And obviously, he served his country, he served the world, he served the people around him and about him. I couldn't have this interview come to an end without talking about your grandmother a bit. What was her name? What did she do? How did she grow up? And most importantly, how did she manage a happy life with such a busy, engaged, in some ways demanding, to quote you, kind of husband?
Well, what is important to remember is that my grandfather, throughout his life, always had to have a strong woman at his side. For the first 20 years, he had his nanny. His nanny, Mrs. Everest, was probably the most important thing that his mother, Jenny Jerome, the American girl from Brooklyn, did for the world, because she chose this extraordinary woman to be her son's nanny. If she'd chosen a different woman, history might have been very different. Because
How was this nanny different? What was so special about her?
well, she was a very strong-minded woman, and he absolutely adored her. And the fact was that she was the rock of his early life. It wasn't his parents, who he adored, but they were remote. His father, he was always striving for his attention, and the father died just when Winston felt he was about to get it. And his mother, he said, "She shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance." And so Mrs. Everest was the person who, when he said, it was to her, "I poured out all my many troubles." And when she died, when he was 20, he said, "She was the dearest and most intimate friend of my whole first 20 years. So That was the first one. Then he had his mother for the next 14 years. And
Clementine?
Jenny Jerome, his mother.
Oh, his mother, sorry.
And she was at his side, and he said we worked together more like brother and sister than mother and son. And then he met Clementine, who had grown up from in an aristocratic but impoverished family. She used to give French lessons when she was sort of in her very early 20s. And he met her for the first time he met her. He saw her across the room and said, "Can you introduce me to her?" And so he was introduced. She thought he was the rudest young man she'd ever met. So it wasn't a success. A few years later, her great aunt asked her at the last minute to fill in at a dinner party because someone had dropped out. And she turned up and she had to sit next to him, and that was it. A few months later, they were married. And as he wrote...
Did he get less rude, or did she become more tolerant?
Perhaps he learned a few manners, and perhaps she was a bit more confident. And I mean, because he said it was a good relationship. I mean, he wrote his autobiography of the first part of his life, and he ended it at his marriage. And he said, "And we married and lived happily ever after." And that was the case. But they didn't have a conventional marriage from the point of view that they were on top of each other all the time. And he must have been a difficult man to live with. And the whole house centered around him. Everything, when he was there, it centered around him. And my grandmother, she was a liberal. He was on the whole a conservative, but was a liberal for 20 years of their marriage. But so they had different political views. She did not like a lot of his friends. And she hated the south of France, which he loved. But they had this extraordinary marriage. And during the war, of course, you've got to have someone who will tell you the truth. By the time we got to 1940, the only person who could tell him how it was his wife. And one day she decided that she had to do something. And she decided to write him a letter. She wanted to tell him something, but she knew that if she started, she wouldn't get past the first sentence because he would have been irritated and cut her off. So she wrote him a letter, she tore it up, she wrote it again. This is in 1940. And she said that people had been noticing that he was difficult and being bad-tempered, and she'd noticed that he wasn't being as kind as he used to be, and she couldn't bear the idea that people didn't love him as they always had done before, and therefore he must do something about it. Basically, it's quite a long letter. And we assume that must have had effect, because she didn't write another one, but she was the only person who could say, "Winston, that's not right, you can't do it." And so she certainly played her part in history in a big way.
So you have written 6 or 7 books now.
5.
5 books. And what are your future plans? What are you working on, and what do you hope to make happen in the next few years?
What I hope to make happen is I made one television documentary which I loved, and I've got a number of projects which everyone says we'd love to do, but I'd love to make more television about my grandfather and my grandmother, because there's so much that hasn't been done, and I really would like to do it. But whether I'll achieve it or not, people always say, yes, that would be great, but then you have to find the money. And you know all about finding money. And so this is the difficulty. And so I'm still trying.
What of all of the remnants of remembrance of Winston Churchill, whether it is the books have been written about him, whether it's the movies have been produced about his life, whether it's exhibits of his artwork or any other achievement, what stands out for you as perhaps the best piece that demonstrates his legacy?
Well, I think the best piece that demonstrates his legacy is not one piece, it's the memories and the feelings and the love that people have for him and his memory. But of course this will all fade away. And there are not too many people around now who can feel they saw him or knew him. But I think that his books will go on, and his paintings will last, and I think I'm sure he will always take his place in history.
Mm-hmm. Well, he has, and he is in history in a very meaningful way. If you were speaking to a group of students in a classroom at High Point University, and you were to begin a sentence or a paragraph with, "If my grandfather were here today speaking to you young men and women, getting your education, preparing yourself for life," he would probably look you eyeball to eyeball and say, "Here are 2 or 3 things you must do to succeed in life." One of them would be courage. What would be the other 2?
Well, I think he would say, you believe in yourself, and if you believe in something and that it's the right thing, don't listen to other people and go ahead with it. And I think he also would give them the advice that he gave to the pupils of his old school when he went there during the war when it had been bombed, which was never, never, never give in.
Mm-hmm. Perseverance and persistence. Be tenacious. Be willing to examine what the future can bring you. It is absolutely delightful to have you on the campus of High Point University. It's been a wonderful hour to chat with you about your grandfather and about your perspective of his life and his memory. We commend you for all the great work that you are doing, bringing these lessons to so many people around the globe. We hope when you come back to the United States, you would visit us in North Carolina. You'd come again to the campus of High Point University so we can learn from you, listen to you, and be inspired by you. I thank you for spending this time with me. Celia Sandys, we wish for you great things always.
Well, thank you for having me at your wonderful university.
Thank you very much. It's good to have you here.
Quality public television is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.